An older man's voice slices through the glittering silence of the dining hall. "You don't belong here, Janet." The words are sharp, meant to wound, and they hang in the air like broken glass. His raised hand and sneer make the insult feel final. But before the humiliation can land, another voice cuts through the tension. Low, cold and commanding. "Enough. You've said more than you should." The line is lethal in its restraint. Authority from an unexpected source freezes the room. Guests shift uncomfortably, eyes darting between the accuser and the man who has just intervened. Instantly, questions ignite. Who is this billionaire? Why does he speak with such power? And what will he do next? The scene builds tension through sensory detail. The chandelier light spilling across polished silverware, the echo of crystal glasses paused mid-air, faces draining of color as the confrontation unfolds. Janet W. Sampson sits poised at the long table, her deep blue dress and natural afro radiating quiet strength, even as her ex-husband John D. Johnson leans forward mid-shout, hand raised in accusation. His arrogance fills the room. His words meant to erase her dignity in front of elites. Then Edwin M. Smith, the Korean billionaire, rises. His jaw is clenched, his eyes sharp, and his presence shifts the atmosphere instantly. The guests sense the balance of power tilting. The introduction grabs attention by combining public humiliation, racial tension, and the sudden intervention of a powerful figure, promising a shocking reversal in a high-status setting. Like the competitor's flow, this intro uses sensory detail plus social hierarchy plus sudden authority to hook the audience. It sets up the emotional arc. Janet's quiet restraint, John's cruelty, and Edwin's looming authority that will redefine the evening. Chapter 1. The chandeliers glowed like frozen fire above the long dining table, their light spilling across polished silverware and crystal glasses. The air was heavy with wealth, the kind of atmosphere where every gesture carried weight. Janet sat near the center, her deep blue dress catching the golden light, her natural afro a crown of quiet defiance. She held herself with poise, shoulders straight, chin lifted, though her eyes betrayed the tension she carried. Every breath was measured, every movement restrained, as though she knew the room was waiting for her to falter. John leaned forward, his patterned tie shifting as his voice rose above the muted clink of cutlery. "You don't belong here, Janet," he said, his words sharp enough to slice through the hum of conversation. His hand lifted, palm down, in a gesture meant to diminish her, to press her into silence. Guests turned their heads, some startled, others eager for spectacle. His tone carried arrogance, the kind that thrived in rooms like this, where reputation was currency and cruelty could be dressed as wit. Janet's lips pressed together, her gaze steady on the table before her. She did not answer. Her silence was deliberate, a refusal to give him the satisfaction of reaction. But John mistook restraint for weakness. He leaned closer, his voice dripping with disdain. "You think that dress makes you one of us. You think sitting at this table erases what you are. You're nothing but a reminder of mistakes best forgotten." The words hung in the air, heavy and humiliating. A few guests shifted uncomfortably, eyes darting between Janet and John, unsure whether to intervene or remain complicit in silence. Janet's fingers tightened around the stem of her glass, but her face remained composed, her dignity intact even as the insult burned. John's sneer deepened. "You were never fit for this family, never fit for me. And now you come crawling back, desperate for attention, desperate for scraps of respect you'll never earn." His voice echoed beneath the chandeliers, each syllable meant to strip her of worth. Janet lifted her eyes at last, meeting his gaze with quiet strength. There was no anger in her expression, only a calm that unsettled him. She did not rise to his bait, did not crumble under the weight of his words. Her silence became its own weapon, a mirror reflecting his cruelty back at him. The room held its breath, the tension coiling tighter with each passing second. John's arrogance filled the space, but beneath it, something shifted, an awareness among the guests that Janet's composure was not weakness but power. She sat unbroken, her dignity intact, while his voice grew louder, harsher, desperate to provoke a reaction that never came. And in that silence, the insult began to lose its edge. The humiliation he tried to craft became his own, a spectacle of cruelty laid bare before the eyes of those who mattered most. The stage was set, the balance of power already beginning to tilt, though John had yet to realize it. The silence after John's first insult seemed to stretch, heavy and suffocating, until he filled it again with words sharpened into weapons. His voice rose, carrying across the long table, echoing beneath the chandeliers. "You sit here as if you belong, Janet, but everyone knows the truth. You were never one of us. You were a mistake I should have corrected sooner." His hand cut the air in a dismissive gesture. His face twisted with disdain. Guests shifted in their seats, the scrape of a chair leg against marble sounding louder than it should. No one spoke. Eyes flicked toward Janet, then back to John, as if watching a duel unfold in slow motion. Janet remained still, her posture unbroken, her gaze steady. The quiet strength in her composure only seemed to fuel John's fury. "You think silence makes you noble?" he pressed, leaning forward, his voice dripping with contempt. "It makes you weak, makes you pathetic. You came here tonight hoping for sympathy, hoping someone would forget what you are. But I won't let them. I won't let you rewrite history." His words struck like blows, each one meant to strip away dignity. The guests sat frozen, caught between discomfort and curiosity, unwilling to intervene yet unable to look away. The tension thickened, pressing against the walls, until even the flicker of candlelight seemed to hesitate. Janet's fingers tightened around the stem of her glass, but she did not flinch. Her silence was deliberate, her restraint a shield. John mistook it for surrender. His voice grew louder, harsher, desperate to provoke a reaction. "You were nothing but a burden. You drained me, embarrassed me, dragged my name through the mud. And now you dare to sit here, dressed like you belong, pretending you're equal to the rest of us." The cruelty in his tone made a few guests glance down at their plates, shame flickering across their faces. Yet none spoke. The confrontation had become a spectacle, and they were unwilling participants, trapped in the gravity of John's rage. Janet finally lifted her eyes, meeting his with a calm that unsettled him. She did not speak, but the quiet defiance in her gaze was louder than words. It was a refusal to break, a refusal to let his venom define her. The silence that followed was unbearable, a mirror reflecting his cruelty back at him. John's jaw tightened. He slammed his palm against the table, crystal glasses trembling at the impact. "Look at her," he shouted to the room. "Look at this woman who thinks she can stand among us. She's nothing. She will always be nothing." The words rang out, but instead of triumph, they left a hollow echo. The guests remained silent, their faces pale, their eyes betraying unease. The confrontation had escalated, but the balance of power was shifting. Janet's composure was unbroken, her dignity intact, while John's desperation grew louder, harsher, and more revealing. The echo of John's last words still hung in the air when a chair scraped against the marble floor. The sound was deliberate, sharp enough to draw every eye. Edwin M. Smith rose slowly from his seat, the tailored lines of his dark suit catching the chandelier's glow. His jaw was set, his eyes cold, and the weight of his presence shifted the atmosphere in an instant. Where John's voice had filled the room with arrogance, Edwin's silence carried something heavier, authority. The guests turned, their unease palpable. Some leaned back, others froze mid-gesture, as though instinct warned them not to move. Edwin did not rush. He adjusted his cuff with precision, then placed both hands on the table, his gaze fixed on John. "Enough," he said, his voice low but resonant, cutting through the tension like steel. The single word silenced the room more effectively than any shout. John faltered, his sneer slipping for the briefest moment. He tried to recover, leaning forward again, but the confidence in his posture wavered. "This isn't your concern," he snapped, though the edge in his tone betrayed unease. She doesn't belong here. She never did. Edwin's eyes narrowed, the faintest flicker of disdain crossing his face. What doesn't belong here, he replied evenly, is your cruelty paraded as truth. His words were calm, but they carried the weight of judgment, each syllable deliberate, each pause intentional. The guests felt it, an authority that did not need volume to command obedience. Janet's breath caught, though she remained composed. She had not asked for rescue, had not expected anyone to intervene. Yet Edwin's presence was undeniable. His defense of her shifting the balance of power. The humiliation John had tried to craft began to unravel, exposed under the billionaire's gaze. The silence stretched, broken only by the faint clink of a spoon against porcelain as a nervous guest set it down. Edwin straightened, his voice steady. You speak of history as if rewriting it will absolve you. But the truth is plain, and everyone here sees it. Your words reveal more about you than they ever could about her. John's face flushed, his hand tightening around the stem of his glass. He opened his mouth to retort, but the weight of Edwin's stare held him back. The guests watched, their discomfort shifting into something else. Recognition. They saw the arrogance stripped bare, the cruelty laid open, and the authority that now stood against it. Edwin's gaze swept the table, lingering on each guest, reminding them of the gravity of the moment. This dinner was meant to be a gathering of respect, he said, his tone colder now. If anyone here believes humiliation is acceptable, then perhaps you should reconsider the company you keep. The words landed with finality. The atmosphere had changed completely. Where John's voice had once dominated, now Edwin's authority filled the room, leaving no space for cruelty to thrive. Janet sat taller, her dignity intact, while John's silence became its own humiliation. The room seemed to hold its breath after Edwin's words, the silence pressing down like velvet. John's face flushed with anger, his jaw tight as he searched for something sharp enough to reclaim control. But across from him, Janet sat unmoving, her posture regal, her expression calm. The contrast was stark. His fury against her restraint, his arrogance against her quiet strength. She lifted her glass with deliberate grace, the crystal catching the chandelier's glow. Her hand was steady, her movements unhurried, as though she refused to let his rage dictate her rhythm. The guests noticed. Their eyes lingered on her, drawn to the composure that seemed to radiate from her presence. She did not need to speak. Her silence was louder than his accusations. John leaned forward again, his voice sharp, desperate. Do you see this? She hides behind silence because she has nothing to say, nothing to defend. She knows she doesn't belong here. His words rang hollow, bouncing against the walls without finding purchase. The guests shifted, some exchanging uneasy glances, others lowering their eyes. Janet set her glass down gently, the faint sound of crystal against wood punctuating the air. She met John's gaze, her eyes steady, unflinching. There was no anger in her expression, only a calm that unsettled him more than any outburst could. It was the calm of someone who had endured storms and refused to be moved by thunder. Her silence became a mirror, reflecting his cruelty back at him. The more he spoke, the more his arrogance was laid bare, while her dignity remained intact. The guests began to see it, the imbalance, the desperation in his voice, the strength in her restraint. John's hand slammed against the table, glasses trembling at the impact. Say something, he demanded, his voice cracking under the weight of his own frustration. Defend yourself if you can. Janet did not flinch. She inhaled slowly, her shoulders rising and falling with measured grace. Then, in a voice soft but clear, she spoke. I don't need to defend myself against lies. The words were simple, but they carried a weight that silenced the room. Her tone was steady, her delivery calm, and yet it cut deeper than any shout. John recoiled, his mouth opening to retort, but no words came. The guests watched, their silence shifting into quiet recognition. Janet's dignity had not only survived his assault, it had exposed his weakness. She folded her hands in her lap, her posture unbroken, her presence commanding without force. The confrontation had escalated, but she had not been dragged into his chaos. Instead, she had risen above it, her quiet strength a shield that turned his arrogance into his own undoing. The atmosphere shifted once more. Where John's voice had once dominated, now Janet's composure filled the room, leaving him diminished, his fury unraveling in the face of her unshakable dignity. The silence after Janet's calm words lingered, heavy and unyielding, until Edwin shifted his stance. His presence filled the room, commanding without effort, and when he spoke, his voice carried the weight of judgment. "You speak of dignity as if it were yours to grant, John," he said evenly, his gaze fixed on the man across the table. "But dignity is not yours to give nor to take. And if we are to speak of truth tonight, then let us speak honestly." The guests leaned forward, drawn into the gravity of his words. John's face tightened, his sneer faltering as Edwin continued. "You accuse Janet of weakness, of desperation, of clinging to a place she does not deserve. Yet it is you who has clung to lies. You who has built your reputation on shadows and deceit." A murmur rippled through the room, the guests exchanging uneasy glances. Edwin's tone remained calm, but each word struck with precision. "How many here know," he asked, his voice carrying across the table, "that the man so eager to humiliate his ex-wife has been hiding failures of his own? That the empire he boasts of is crumbling beneath the weight of his arrogance?" John's hand tightened around his glass, knuckles white. "You don't know what you're talking about," he snapped, but the tremor in his voice betrayed him. Edwin's eyes narrowed, his expression unchanging. "I know enough. I know about the investors you've lost, the deals you sabotaged with your recklessness. I know about the debts you've concealed, the contracts you broke, the trust you squandered. And I know that your attempt to humiliate Janet tonight is nothing more than a distraction from your own failures." The words landed like stones, each one heavier than the last. The guests sat frozen, their silence louder than any protest. John's arrogance, once so commanding, now seemed brittle, fragile under the weight of exposure. Edwin leaned forward slightly, his voice dropping to something colder. "You call her desperate, yet it is you who is desperate. Desperate to maintain an illusion, desperate to silence the truth, desperate to make her smaller so your failures seem less. But the truth does not bend to your arrogance, John. It stands unshaken just as she does." Janet's eyes flickered toward Edwin, gratitude unspoken but clear. She had held her composure, her dignity intact, and now his words had turned the spotlight away from her and onto the man who had tried to destroy her. John's face flushed, his mouth opening to retort, but no words came. The guests saw it, the unraveling, the cracks in his facade. His humiliation was no longer hers to bear. It was his own, laid bare before the very people he had sought to impress. Edwin straightened, his gaze sweeping the table. "Let us be clear," he said, his tone final. "The only failure exposed tonight is yours, John. And no amount of shouting will change that." The air was thick with Edwin's words, their weight still pressing down on the room when Janet finally moved. She straightened in her chair, her hands folding neatly in her lap, her gaze fixed on John. The quiet strength she had carried all evening sharpened into something more deliberate, more dangerous. When she spoke, her voice was calm, but it carried the kind of clarity that made every guest lean in, unable to look away. "You call me desperate," she began, her tone steady. "But desperation was never mine. It was yours. You were desperate to please your family, desperate to protect your reputation, desperate to erase me when I no longer served your pride." Her words cut cleanly, each syllable deliberate, each pause heavy with truth. John's jaw tightened, his eyes narrowing, but Janet did not falter. "You let them accuse me of theft, of lies, of things I never did. You let them call me names, humiliate me, strip me of dignity, and you stood by. You didn't defend me. You didn't protect me. You betrayed me." The guests shifted, their silence thick with recognition. Janet's voice did not rise, but the calmness in it made the truth sharper. You married me knowing the prejudice I would face. You promised love, promised protection. But when the insults came, you chose silence. When the lies grew, you chose complicity. And when I needed you most, you chose betrayal. John's hand trembled against the table, his glass rattling faintly. That's not true, he muttered, but the weakness in his tone betrayed him. Janet's eyes held his, unflinching. It is true. You gave me a home filled with cruelty, a family that despised me, and a husband who lacked the courage to stand beside me. You let them destroy me, and when I was broken, you discarded me like I was nothing. That is your legacy, John. Not strength, not honor. Betrayal. Her words hung in the air, heavy and undeniable. The guests looked at John, their expressions shifting, the arrogance they once admired now unraveling under the weight of her truth. Janet inhaled slowly, her composure unbroken. You tried to humiliate me tonight, but humiliation belongs to you. 'Cause everyone here sees it now. They see the cruelty you hid behind arrogance. They see the betrayal you dressed as pride. And they see me, still standing, still dignified, despite everything you did. John's face flushed, his mouth opening to retort, but no words came. The silence that followed was louder than any protest. Janet's reckoning had stripped him bare, leaving him diminished, his cruelty exposed for all to see. She leaned back slightly, her voice soft but final. You cannot erase me, John. You cannot rewrite what you did. And you cannot take from me the dignity I reclaimed the moment I stopped believing your lies. The room was silent, the reckoning complete. Janet's truth had been spoken, and John's arrogance had finally met its end. The weight of Janet's words lingered in the air, heavy and undeniable, when the silence began to shift. It was subtle at first, a guest lowering their gaze, another setting down a glass with deliberate care, but soon the atmosphere thickened into something unmistakable. The room was no longer with John. His voice, once loud and commanding, now sounded brittle, hollow, stripped of authority. John tried to recover, his hand tightening around the edge of the table. She's twisting everything, he said, his tone sharp but trembling. You all know what she's like. You know what she did. Yet the words fell flat, lacking conviction. The guests did not nod in agreement. Instead, they exchanged glances, their expressions uneasy, their silence damning. One man at the far end of the table cleared his throat, the sound breaking the tension. I remember the necklace, he said quietly, his eyes fixed on John. I remember how quickly you accused her, and how quickly you dismissed her defense. His voice carried no malice, only the weight of memory, but it was enough to tilt the balance further. Another guest leaned forward, her tone sharp. You spoke of loyalty, John, but where was yours? You let your family tear her apart while you stood by. That isn't strength. That's cowardice. John's face flushed crimson, his mouth opening to retort, but no words came. The accusations he had hurled so freely now returned to him, reshaped into truths he could not escape. His credibility, once a shield, had crumbled into dust. Edwin remained silent, his presence looming, his gaze steady on John. He did not need to speak. The guests were speaking for him now. Each word, each glance, stripped John further of the authority he had tried to wield. Janet sat composed, her dignity intact, watching as the tide turned. She had not begged for sympathy, had not pleaded for understanding. Her strength had been quiet, her truth unshakable, and now it was John who stood exposed. A woman near the center of the table shook her head, her voice low but firm. You tried to humiliate her, but all you've done is humiliate yourself. We see you now, John. We see what you are. The words landed with finality. John's shoulders sagged, his arrogance unraveling into desperation. He looked around the table, searching for an ally, but found only silence and disapproval. The guests had turned against him, their judgment clear. The collapse was complete. His credibility was gone, his power stripped away, his cruelty laid bare for all to see. And in that moment, the humiliation he had tried to inflict on Janet became his own, a spectacle of arrogance undone by truth. The collapse of John's credibility left the room in uneasy silence, but it was Edwin who filled the void. He rose fully now, his presence commanding, his gaze sweeping across the table with deliberate precision. The guests straightened instinctively, as though his authority demanded posture as well as attention. He did not raise his voice, yet every word carried the weight of finality. "This ends here," Edwin said, his tone calm but edged with steel. "No more insults, no more lies, no more cruelty disguised as tradition." His eyes locked on John, who sat rigid, his face pale, his arrogance stripped away. "You tried to humiliate her, but humiliation belongs to you. And everyone here sees it." Janet sat quietly, her composure unbroken, but Edwin's words wrapped around her like armor. He did not speak for her. Her strength had already spoken, but he stood beside her, amplifying what the room had witnessed. His authority was not borrowed from wealth alone. It was the authority of a man who had built power without deceit, who carried influence without arrogance. He turned to the guests, his gaze steady. "You came here tonight expecting civility. Instead, you were made witnesses to cruelty. That is not the mark of leadership. That is the mark of weakness." The guests shifted, some nodding faintly, others lowering their eyes, unwilling to meet his stare. John tried to speak, his voice cracking. "You don't understand." Edwin cut him off with a single glance, sharp enough to silence him. "I understand more than you think. I understand that power without integrity is nothing. I understand that respect cannot be demanded through fear or humiliation. And I understand that Janet has shown more dignity tonight than you have shown in your entire life." The words struck with precision, leaving John diminished, his protest swallowed by the weight of truth. Edwin's authority filled the space, redefining the dynamic entirely. Where John had once dominated with arrogance, now Edwin commanded with calm certainty. He placed a hand lightly on Janet's shoulder, a gesture protective yet respectful, and addressed the room once more. "If anyone here believes she does not belong, then you should reconsider what belonging means. Because tonight, she has shown strength, restraint, and dignity in the face of cruelty. That is belonging. That is honor." The guests remained silent, but their silence was no longer complicit. It was acknowledgement. The balance had shifted, the power redefined. Janet's quiet strength had exposed John's weakness, and Edwin's authority had sealed the reckoning. John sat slumped, his arrogance gone, his credibility shattered. Edwin did not gloat, did not revel in victory. He simply stood, his presence unyielding, his protection of Janet clear. The evening had changed, the hierarchy rewritten. And in that moment, it was undeniable. The billionaire's authority had become the truth that no one could challenge. The tension in the room had shifted entirely. Where once John's voice had filled the air with arrogance, now silence reigned, heavy with judgment. The guests avoided his gaze, their discomfort plain, while Janet sat tall, her dignity untouched. Edwin remained standing beside her, his presence commanding, his authority undeniable. The balance of power had been rewritten, and everyone knew it. Janet rose slowly, her movements deliberate, graceful. The deep blue of her dress shimmered under the chandelier light as she pushed back her chair. She did not rush, did not falter. Her composure was unbroken, her strength radiating in every step. The guests watched, their eyes following her, some with admiration, others with quiet shame for having remained silent too long. John shifted in his seat, his face pale, his mouth opening as if to speak, but no words came. His credibility had collapsed, his arrogance stripped bare, and now he sat diminished, powerless. Janet's gaze brushed over him briefly, steady and unflinching before moving on. She did not need to speak to him again. Her silence was louder than any rebuke. Edwin placed a hand lightly at her back, a gesture protective yet respectful. He did not lead her, she did not need leading, but he walked beside her, his presence a shield against any lingering cruelty. Together they moved toward the exit, their steps echoing across the marble floor, each one a declaration of strength. The guests parted instinctively, creating space for her passage. Some lowered their heads, others murmured faint apologies, but Janet did not pause. She carried herself with quiet pride, her dignity intact, her spirit unbroken. The humiliation John had tried to inflict had become his own, and she left the room not as a victim, but as a woman who had endured and risen above. At the doorway, she paused for a moment, her eyes sweeping the room. The chandeliers glowed above, the long table stretched out behind her, and the faces of those who had witnessed everything stared back. "This dinner was meant to remind me of my place," she said softly, her voice calm but resonant. "Instead, it reminded me of my strength." The words lingered, sinking into the silence. Then she turned, her chin lifted, and stepped out into the night. Edwin followed, his presence steady, his authority still echoing in the room they left behind. John remained seated, his shoulders slumped, his gaze fixed on the table before him. The guests whispered now, their voices low, their judgment clear. His attempt to destroy her had destroyed him instead. Outside, the cool air met Janet's skin, refreshing, liberating. She inhaled deeply, her chest rising with a sense of release. Edwin glanced at her, his expression softened, his eyes filled with quiet respect. She met his gaze, and for the first time that evening, a faint smile touched her lips. She had walked into the mansion burdened by old wounds. She walked out empowered, supported, and free. The night had unraveled into something John could no longer control. His voice, once sharp and commanding, had been reduced to fragments of protest that carried no weight. The guests who had once leaned toward him now leaned away, their eyes filled with judgment, their silence louder than any condemnation. His credibility lay shattered across the polished floor, and with it, the illusion of power he had clung to for so long. John sat slumped in his chair, his shoulders heavy, his gaze fixed on the table as though it might offer him refuge. But there was no refuge left. The empire of arrogance he had built had collapsed in front of witnesses who would carry the story beyond these walls. His ruin was not only personal, it was public, undeniable, and complete. Janet stood tall, her presence radiant in the aftermath. The deep blue of her dress shimmered under the chandelier light, her natural afro a crown of quiet defiance. She had endured his cruelty, his betrayal, his attempt to erase her, and yet she remained unbroken. Her dignity had not only survived, it had been reclaimed piece by piece, word by word, until it stood brighter than the wealth surrounding her. She did not look at John again. There was no need. His downfall was his own, and she had no desire to linger in the ruins he had created. Instead, she turned toward the doorway, her steps measured, graceful, each one carrying her further from the weight of the past. The guests parted instinctively, their eyes following her, some with admiration, others with quiet shame for their silence earlier. Edwin walked beside her, his presence steady, protective but never overshadowing. He had intervened when cruelty threatened to consume the evening, but it was Janet's strength that had carried the night. Together they moved through the mansion's grand hall, their footsteps echoing against marble, a rhythm of liberation. Outside, the cool air met her skin, crisp and refreshing, as though the world itself acknowledged her freedom. She inhaled deeply, her chest rising with a sense of release, her spirit lighter than it had been in years. The night sky stretched above, vast and unbroken, a reminder that her story was hers to reclaim, hers to define. Behind her, John remained trapped in the wreckage of his own arrogance, his ruin sealed by the truth he could no longer deny. Ahead of her, the path was open, unmarked by his betrayal, illuminated instead by the strength she had carried through every storm. Janet walked away free, her dignity intact, her story reclaimed. She had entered the mansion burdened by old wounds, but she left it transformed, no longer defined by cruelty, no longer diminished by betrayal. She was her own, unbroken, and the night belonged to her.